My name is Marjorie Elwood. I'm 67 years old. The courthouse smelled the same as it did 30 years ago. Cold marble, old paper, and a trace of nervous sweat. I had promised myself I would never step into this building again, yet here I was, my hand steadying my son's arm as we moved through the echoing hallway toward courtroom 4. Daniel leaned heavily on his crutch, his gait uneven, but proud. He hated the crutch, hated the eyes that followed him, pitying, whispering. He was 38, too young to walk like an old man, too young to be fighting for what should have been his, without question. Outside the courtroom, I brushed the dust from his shoulder and straightened his tie. It was the same dark blue one he used to wear to client meetings before the accident. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his grip on the crutch. "Mom, you don't have to be here," he murmured. I gave a small smile. "Yes, I do." When we stepped inside, the room turned toward us. The wooden benches gleamed under fluorescent lights, and the air felt tighter than it should have. On the far side sat Sienna, my former daughter-in-law. Her face, powdered lips, painted in defiance. Her lawyer, a tall woman with sharp posture, whispered something into her ear. Sienna smiled thinly, crossing one leg over the other, her red heels tapping out a rhythm that didn't belong in a place built for truth. Her parents sat beside her smug, certain of victory. Daniel lowered himself carefully onto the bench reserved for the plaintiff, his shoulders hunched under the weight of more than pain. I sat behind him, feeling the eyes in the room measure us, weigh our worth. The bailiff called for silence. Then the side door opened. Judge Stephen Morales entered, a man whose name I hadn't heard in years, but whose face I recognized instantly. His hair was grayer now, but his walk carried the same measured authority I remembered from when he was still an eager young attorney, shadowing senior counsel in my old firm. He adjusted his glasses, glanced at the case file, and looked toward Daniel. For a brief moment, I thought I saw sympathy flicker in his expression. But then his gaze moved past my son and landed on me. His hand froze mid-motion. Our eyes met, and I saw recognition crash across his face, followed by something like disbelief. His lips parted, but no sound came out. He leaned slightly forward, fingers tightening around the bench. The courtroom, still settling into order, went utterly silent. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. Then, so softly that only those of us closest to the front could hear, he spoke. "Why are you here?" The question wasn't procedural, it was personal. Half awe, half alarm. It sounded like he was seeing a ghost. Sienna's confident smile faltered. Her lawyer stopped mid-note. Daniel turned his head confused, and I felt the pulse of every whispered rumor beginning to stir behind me. I didn't answer the judge. I only sat a little straighter, the years I'd buried pressing against my ribs like a door about to open. The past, it seemed, had just recognized my face. The sound of the gavel brought me back to the present, but only barely. My name, Marjorie Elwood, still hung unspoken in the air, like a shadow no one dared acknowledge. I saw the judge glance down at the papers before him again, his jaw tightening, as though he'd stumbled across something he wished he hadn't. I had once stood on the other side of that bench. Younger, sharper, filled with a belief that truth, if argued hard enough, could win against anything. In those days, I lived in heels and late-night coffee, the kind of woman who knew every corridor of the Cook County Courthouse by the sound of her own footsteps. Reporters had called me the Iron Spine of Chicago, the defense attorney who wouldn't bend even when the city did. But faith is a fragile thing. I lost mine the year the Caldwell case collapsed. It was supposed to be my triumph, a class action suit, exposing a chain of city inspectors who took cash to overlook dangerous housing violations. We had witnesses, documents, recordings. I was sure we would win. Instead, on the third day of testimony, the presiding judge, an old friend of my mentor, dismissed every key piece of evidence as inadmissible. The verdict was thrown out. Later, it surfaced that he'd been paid off by one of the developers we were suing. By the time the press caught wind, the city had already turned the story into something else. My reputation went up in flames faster than any building those corrupt men had condemned. No one believed a word I said. The case died. The judge retired quietly to Florida. And I buried my law license at the back of a closet and never touched it again. I remember the night I packed my office. The building's janitor, a kind old man named Lewis, watched me fill the box with case files, photos, and the framed quote that used to hang over my desk. Justice is the constant will to render to each his due. I stared at those words until they blurred, realizing I no longer believed them. From that night on, I avoided this place like a plague. I built a smaller life, volunteering, gardening, raising, Daniel pretending the silence was peace. But seeing Judge Morales, now remembering he'd once been a trembling associate who shadowed me through closing arguments, cracked open something I'd kept buried for too long. He remembered me not the woman in the back row today, but the one who once walked these halls like she owned them. And in his eyes I could see the same unspoken question I'd asked myself for years. What happened to you? I sat perfectly still, but inside an old current stirred. The courtroom's stale air, the scrape of shoes against tile, the rustle of papers, they were all sounds I thought I'd forgotten. Yet each one called me back to the person I used to be, the woman who'd believed that the law could still mean something. I hadn't come here to resurrect her, but she was awake now, breathing just beneath my skin. After the Caldwell case collapsed, I told myself I would never again depend on anyone's promise of justice. I returned home to an empty apartment, the kind that holds its breath when you walk in. My husband Richard had already packed his things. He left a note on the kitchen counter, 12 words that ended 15 years of marriage. You loved your work more than me. I can't live with a ghost. Daniel was only 10 then. He came home from school with his backpack half unzipped, a bruise on his knee, and a grin too bright for the day I had to tell him his father was gone. I remember sitting him down at the table, my voice steady only because his eyes were too young to see them tremble. He asked if Dad would come back. I said no. He asked why. I told him sometimes people forget what love means. He nodded like he understood, but that night I heard him crying into his pillow. Those years were made of long mornings and longer nights. I took every small legal job I could find, drafting contracts, reviewing insurance claims, settling petty disputes for people who could barely pay. When the rent climbed higher than my paychecks, I packed our lives into cardboard boxes and moved to a cheaper place off West Archer Avenue. The building smelled of mildew, but the sun hit the windows at just the right angle in the afternoons, and Daniel could still see the trains from his room. We made a routine out of survival. I'd wake before dawn, make coffee too weak to waste, and write notes on his lunch napkin, little reminders that tomorrow could be better. He'd leave drawings on my desk in return, crooked houses, stick figure families, a son that always smiled. By the time he turned 16, Daniel had found weekend work at a local repair shop. He'd come home with oil on his hands and stories about how engines worked his eyes alive in a way I hadn't seen since before his father left. One evening, I found him at the kitchen table, measuring lines on graph paper, a stack of textbooks open beside him. I'm going to build things, Mom, he said. Real things. Things that last. I laughed softly and asked what made him so sure. He looked up and said, "Because you do." When college letters started arriving, I kept them in a drawer until I knew which one he wanted most. University of Illinois Engineering. I remember the way he tried to hide his excitement the same way I hid my fear. Tuition was more than I could ever afford. I spent a whole night sitting at the kitchen table staring at my old wedding ring. By morning, I knew what I had to do. The pawn shop owner weighed it without emotion. The ring gleamed under the fluorescent light, an old circle of promises finally worth something practical. I walked out with a wad of cash and the smell of metal on my fingers. I didn't tell Daniel until years later. Some sacrifices are better kept silent until they bloom. He graduated with honors, working every spare hour to help me pay rent. Then came the day he brought me to an empty plot of land back near West Archer, where the air smelled of cut grass and new beginnings. "This is where it'll be," he said. Months later, a small 2-story house stood there, pale blue siding, white trim, a porch just wide enough for 2 chairs. Daniel handed me the keys with a grin that looked like the boy who once drew stick houses for me. "This one's ours, Mom," he said. "No one can ever throw us out again." We moved in that summer. I filled the rooms with secondhand furniture and the sound of laughter I thought I'd lost. At night, Daniel would fall asleep on the couch after long shifts, and I'd sit by the window listening to the hum of the city outside the house creaking softly as it settled. For the first time in decades, I believed in permanence. The walls felt solid beneath my palms, the kind that could shelter dreams without fear of eviction. I didn't know then that even the safest walls can't keep every storm away. The call came just after midnight. I remember because I'd been awake staring at the porch light through the rain, thinking about how quiet the house had become since Daniel married Lydia. The phone rang once, twice. Then a voice I didn't know said my name. "Mrs. Elwood. There's been an accident." By the time I reached the hospital, the hallway smelled of disinfectant and metal, and my son's boots sat abandoned beside a gurney. Daniel lay under a thin blanket. Face pale, eyes closed, his left leg bound in plaster, and the right wrapped in bandages that seeped faintly red. Machines beeped in a rhythm that was both proof of life and reminder of fragility. Lydia was already there, pacing her makeup smudged. When she saw me, she burst into tears, arms open, and for a moment, I believed her. I held her close the way I would a daughter, whispering that everything would be all right, even though I didn't know if it would. The doctor came in with words that cut like glass. Multiple fractures, nerve damage, a long recovery. Walking again would require years of therapy, if at all. Daniel didn't speak when he heard it. He only looked at the ceiling, as if searching for a part of himself that had drifted away. The weeks that followed blurred together. Lydia sat by his bedside at first, reading magazines aloud, bringing him soup he barely touched. But sympathy has an expiration date, and hers came sooner than I wanted to believe. When the cast came off, she began sighing at every slow step, every clumsy reach for the crutch. One morning, while I was folding laundry in the kitchen, I heard her voice behind the bedroom door, sharp, tired. "Daniel, I can't keep doing this. I didn't marry a patient. I married a man." Her words landed like stones, each one dull and heavy. I froze the towel slipping from my hands. His reply came quiet but steady. "I'm still that man." There was silence. Then the sound of something breaking, maybe a glass, maybe just whatever held them together. After he came home from rehabilitation, the house changed. The tools in the garage gathered dust. The smell of motor oil was replaced by antiseptic from his therapy sessions. He spent hours by the window, his crutch leaning beside him like a quiet witness. Lydia drifted further each day, late nights at work. New clothes, new perfume, laughter that never reached her eyes when she came home. I tried to help him. The only way I knew, meals, errands, small talk. But he began to shrink inside himself, polite, but distant, ashamed of needing help. Once, as I carried his dinner tray, he said softly, "You shouldn't have to see me like this." I wanted to tell him that mothers don't unsee their children, that I had watched him take his first steps and would stand beside him, even if he never walked another. But I only nodded, afraid that love spoken aloud might make his pain louder. At night, I would listen through the wall for his breathing, counting each sigh like a heartbeat. The house he built for us still stood solid, but inside it, something vital had collapsed. The mornings had grown quieter in the Elwood house, but not peaceful, never peaceful. The kind of silence that lived there was brittle like thin ice over a pond you were afraid to step on. I woke early, as I always did, to make breakfast. The smell of coffee used to fill the kitchen like a promise of calm, but lately it only reminded me of the days before Lydia began to wear her cruelty like perfume, subtle, expensive, and impossible to ignore. That morning, the sunlight crept across the counter, lighting the 2 coffee mugs I had set out by habit, one for Daniel, one for her. He would never ask for it, but he still noticed when it wasn't there. Marriage has its quiet rituals. I wasn't ready to let this one die. Lydia came down the stairs in a silk robe, her phone pressed to her ear. Her voice was soft at first, the way women sound when they're trying to charm. "Of course, I'll be there by noon," she said, laughing lightly. Then she saw me and lowered her tone, slipping the phone into her pocket. "Morning, Evelyn," she said, though she didn't look at me. "No need to fuss. I'll grab something on my way out." I nodded, trying not to show how her words stung. "He hasn't eaten yet," I murmured. "You could sit with him. He's been asking if you'll help him with the physical therapy this week." She poured herself a cup of coffee, black, no sugar, and stirred it, though nothing needed stirring. "He'll manage," she said simply, then took a slow sip, her lipstick leaving a faint crimson ring on the rim. From down the hall came the sound of a crutch scraping the floor, slow and uneven. Daniel appeared in the doorway, pale in his flannel shirt, his right leg stiff. He smiled when he saw me, the kind of smile meant to protect rather than share. "Morning, Mom." I smiled back. "Your coffee's ready." Lydia's expression shifted just slightly, but enough for me to see it. The way her mouth tightened, as if she resented that the word home still included me. She set her cup down with a sharp clink and turned toward Daniel. "You should try to move faster," she said. "All this dragging around, it's depressing." Her voice was almost casual, but every syllable landed like a slap. Daniel froze. I saw his throat tighten before he said gently, "I'm trying." She laughed under her breath and reached for her purse. "Try harder." I felt my jaw clench so tightly I thought my teeth would crack. There are moments when motherhood feels like holding a glass of water while a fire burns beside you. You can't stop it, but you can't throw it either. I wanted to tell her to stop, to remind her that compassion is not a chore. But I stood still, my hand gripping the edge of the counter. When the door closed behind her, Daniel sank into the nearest chair. The silence that followed was suffocating. He took a sip of the coffee and winced it had gone cold. "Guess I'm not much company anymore," he said with a dry laugh. "You're still you," I whispered. He looked away. "She doesn't think so." I wanted to promise him that she'd come around, that people who forget love can relearn it, but lies are cruel in their own way. So instead, I placed my hand over his and said, "Drink your coffee, sweetheart. I'll warm it up." He nodded, but neither of us moved for a long while. Later, when I was washing the cups, I found Lydia's lipstick still printed on the rim of her mug, red, vivid, defiant. I rubbed it clean with my thumb harder than I needed to until the porcelain shone. From that morning on, Every small sound in the house felt like a warning. The clatter of dishes, the creak of floorboards, the metallic click of Daniel's crutch against tile. Lydia's absence became louder than her presence. She spoke less, but every silence she left behind was a battlefield where I fought to keep my anger hidden beneath civility, and every day the air between us thickened, like coffee, left too long to cool bitter and waiting to be spilled. That night, the house was heavy with silence. Rain slid down the windows in thin silver lines, tapping softly against the glass. I'd gone to bed early, but sleep wouldn't come. The quiet felt wrong, too precise, too rehearsed. Somewhere in the distance, a clock ticked, like a metronome keeping time with my unease. I slipped on my robe and walked into the hallway. A faint light spilled from under Clara's door, soft, pale, flickering. I thought she might be reading again. She'd been restless since the lawyers started calling, but as I drew closer, I heard another voice. Lydia's. It was sharp, low, and insistent, the tone she used when she wanted control wrapped in sweetness. Say it again, she whispered. You don't want to live with your daddy anymore. My breath caught. A small, trembling voice followed. But I do, Mommy. I love Daddy. Lydia's reply came fast, her patience fraying. No, Clara. You think you do, but you don't understand. If you tell the judge that we'll lose everything. Do you want to lose your room, your toys? You want to move to Grandma's tiny house? There was a pause, broken by a muffled sob. No. Then say it right, Lydia pressed. You don't want to live with him. You want to stay with me. I stood there, one hand gripping the doorknob. My heart hammered so loudly, I thought they might hear it. I'd known Lydia was cruel in private, cold in public, but this was something else. This was poison dressed as protection. Clara's voice came again, cracked and small. I don't want to live with Daddy, she whispered, as if each word cost her breath. Good girl, Lydia said, her tone suddenly warm, almost proud. Tomorrow, when the lawyer asks, you remember that. You're helping us both. The light in the room went out. Footsteps crossed the carpet. A door clicked shut down the hall. I stayed there frozen, staring at the thin line of darkness beneath Clara's door. My throat ached, but no tears came. There was no space left for grief, not anymore. I turned and went downstairs. The kitchen clock read 12:17. I poured myself a glass of water, but my hand was shaking too much to drink it. I set it down on the counter and leaned against the sink, the cold marble grounding me. I thought of Daniel, of the years he spent building that house brick by brick, promise by promise. I thought of the boy who used to sketch floor plans on napkins and say, one day this will be ours. And now his daughter, the one pure thing left, was being taught to lie, to destroy him. In that moment, something inside me shifted. The warmth that had always defined me, the softness I'd mistaken for strength, turned to something harder, clearer. I went to my desk and opened the bottom drawer. My old briefcase was there, its leather cracked, but still holding the weight of who I used to be. I ran my fingers across the handle, feeling the ghost of my former life stir. I wasn't just a mother anymore. I was a witness. And soon I would be a weapon. The morning they came, the air in the house felt colder than usual, though the sun was bright. I was slicing apples for Clara's lunch when a car door slammed outside, a sharp sound, impatient, entitled. I glanced through the window and saw Lydia step out in a tailored coat, the color of money, her heels tapping the walkway like she owned it. Beside her was another woman, tall, efficient, carrying a leather briefcase that looked too familiar. Jennifer Raines. Once upon a time, we had shared coffee over case files, arguing about strategy until sunrise. She had been ambitious, brilliant, a little ruthless. I'd even helped her prepare for her bar exam. Now, seeing her walk toward my son's home, arm in arm with the woman dismantling his life, something inside me went very still. I wiped my hands on a towel and called down the hall. "Daniel," I said quietly, "you might want to come to the kitchen." By the time he appeared leaning on his crutch, they were already inside. Lydia didn't bother to knock. She tossed her sunglasses onto the counter and smiled a thin, performative curve of her lips. "Let's not make this harder than it has to be," she said, gesturing for Jennifer to open the folder. "We just need signatures." Jennifer slid a stack of papers across the table, her eyes meeting mine for a fraction of a second before flicking away. "This is the property settlement," she said smoothly. "Under Illinois marital law, your son is entitled to retain half of the house's value. Lydia is willing to accept that and move on." "Move on," I repeated softly. The words felt poisonous. Daniel's hand trembled as he reached for the first page. "This is our home," he said. "You helped pick the paint for the upstairs, remember Clara's room." "I'm not here for memories," Lydia interrupted, her tone cool. "I just want what's fair." I stepped forward before my son could answer. "Fair," I said, keeping my voice even, almost gentle. "That's an interesting word. Would you like me to tell you what it means under Illinois law?" Jennifer stiffened just slightly. Lydia crossed her arms. "You're not a lawyer," she said. "Not anymore," I replied. But I still read. I picked up the papers, skimming the first few lines. My fingers remembered the weight of evidence, the rhythm of argument. According to the Illinois Marriage and Dissolution of Marriage Act, Section 503(2), any property acquired by either spouse before the marriage is considered non-marital. That means it remains the sole possession of the original owner. Jennifer's expression flickered. Lydia frowned. "That's not unless," I continued, not raising my voice, "there's clear and convincing evidence that the other spouse contributed to the property's increase in value, which would require financial documentation, renovation receipts, proof of shared investment." I looked up from the papers. "Do you have any of that silence?" Lydia's jaw tightened. "Jennifer." Her lawyer hesitated, then said carefully, "We can argue commingling, but it's weak." I folded the papers neatly and set them back on the table. "Then I'd suggest you don't waste everyone's time." For a moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the ticking of the kitchen clock and the soft hum of the refrigerator. I could feel Daniel's eyes on me, confused, half astonished, maybe a little afraid. Lydia gathered her coat with sharp, angry motions. "You think you can scare me with old tricks?" she said. "No," I replied. "I don't need to." Jennifer closed the folder and gave me a long look, a flicker of old respect, hidden beneath the mask of professionalism. "Come on, Lydia," she murmured. "Let's go." They left without slamming the door, but the echo lingered. Daniel sank into a chair, staring at the table. "Mom," he whispered. "How did you—" I reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "You build a house brick by brick," I said. "You protect it the same way." As I cleared the untouched apples from the counter, the brief scent of ink and legal paper still hung in the air, a smell I hadn't breathed in years. It no longer made me flinch. It steadied me. For the first time since the accident, I realized something the law hadn't left me. It had only been waiting. The rain had turned to sleet by the time I reached the south side of Chicago. The streets were slick gray and shining like polished metal. The old office building where Robert Medina used to work stood wedged between a pawn shop and a closed diner. The sign above the door was half faded, "Medina and Associates Discreet Investigations." I hadn't been here in nearly 20 years. Back then, Robert was the best field investigator I'd ever met. Sharp, cautious, and loyal to the truth, even when it hurt. I wasn't sure he'd still recognize me, but when I stepped into the dimly lit hallway and knocked on the frosted glass door, I heard his voice from inside. "Come in if you're not selling anything." He looked older, but not softer. His hair had gone mostly silver, his shoulders broader with the quiet strength of a man who carried secrets for a living. The office smelled of tobacco and rain. On the desk, a pile of faded case folders sat beside a cold cup of coffee. For a moment, neither of us spoke. His eyes narrowed, studying me. Then slowly he smiled. "I'll be damned," he said. "Marjorie Elwood. The last time I saw you, you swore you'd never set foot near another case." I managed a smile. I lied. He gestured for me to sit. The chair creaked under my weight, familiar and uncomfortable in the best way. "So," he said, leaning back, "what brings you here? Don't tell me you're taking clients again." "It's not a case," I said. "It's my son." His face softened just a little. "Go on." I told him everything: the accident, the divorce, Lydia's new lawyer, the lies she'd coached Clara to tell. As I spoke, he listened the way only Robert could, head tilted, pen tapping, questions sharp, but never cruel. When I mentioned the custody hearing, his expression darkened. "You want me to dig?" he asked quietly. "Yes," I said. "Find out where she goes, who she sees, what she's hiding. I need proof. Something clean. Something that can hold up in court." He exhaled slowly, the kind of sigh that came from years of seeing too many families destroy themselves. "You sure you want this?" "I'm sure." He looked at me for a long time before speaking again. "Truth cuts both ways, Marjorie. Once you pull the thread, it doesn't stop unraveling. I know I said, though I wasn't sure I did." He nodded, pulling a fresh notepad toward him. "All right, I'll need a few days, maybe a week." As he scribbled notes, I watched the man I used to rely on when cases got too dark for courtroom lights. It struck me that this quiet exchange of trust and strategy was what I'd missed most. Not the law, not the verdicts. The pursuit. When I stood to leave, he walked me to the door. "You still have that old briefcase?" he asked. I smiled faintly. "I never got rid of it." "Good," he said. "You might need it again." Outside, the sleet had stopped. The city glistened under the streetlights, sharp and alive. For the first time in years, I felt like I was walking toward something, not away. 3 days later, Robert called. His voice carried that grave steadiness I remembered from our courtroom days. Never dramatic, never kind, just the weight of fact. "I have what you asked for," he said. "Meet me at the diner on Canal, booth by the window." The place hadn't changed in 20 years. The same cracked leather seats, the same waitress with tired eyes, and a pencil tucked behind her ear. I ordered black coffee I wouldn't drink and waited. Robert slid into the booth across from me, his coat still wet from the drizzle outside. Without a word, he placed a thick manila envelope on the table. "Everything's in there," he said. "You were right about her." I stared at the envelope for a moment before opening it. Inside were photographs. Sharp, undeniable. Lydia in a red dress, stepping out of a hotel downtown, her hand resting on the arm of a man I didn't recognize. Another photo, her laughing at a candlelit table, fingers brushing his. The third, most damning of all, her entering the same hotel room at midnight, his hand on her lower back. "Who is he?" I asked. "William Hawke," Robert replied. "Real estate developer. Owns a few properties out in Naperville. Known for getting what he wants and for paying others to help him get it." I swallowed hard. How long? 6 months. Maybe more. He's been transferring money to her account, mostly small sums spread across different days. But last month, there was a big one, $40,000. I traced it to a private brokerage. The word money hit harder than the images. It wasn't just betrayal. It was strategy. Lydia wasn't leaving Daniel because she'd stopped loving him. She was dismantling his life piece by piece, selling the ruins for profit. Robert's voice softened. You wanted the truth. There it is. I nodded, unable to speak. My eyes lingered on one photograph, the one where she smiled. I'd seen that same smile once at my kitchen table when she told me she wanted to learn my apple pie recipe. It wasn't the smile of a stranger. That's what made it unbearable. Robert reached into his coat pocket and handed me a small USB drive. Copies of the transfers, messages, receipts. Keep them safe. Use them only when you're ready. When he left, I stayed in the booth for a long time, the envelope between my hands. Outside, the city kept moving horns, footsteps, the hum of traffic indifferent to the wreckage in a single family's kitchen. That night, I hid the folder in the drawer beneath my desk, under old case files and family photos. Daniel sat in the next room, reading with Clara, his voice soft and patient. I could hear her giggle, could almost believe things were normal. I closed the drawer gently. Some truths aren't meant to heal. They're meant to defend. By the morning of the hearing, the courthouse steps were already lined with people. Word had spread, perhaps through the local press, perhaps through gossip that the divorce of Lydia Elwood and her fallen engineer husband would be heard before Judge Morales. I recognized the tone of curiosity in their whispers. I had seen it countless times before from the other side of the bench. But today, I wasn't an attorney. I was a mother. Inside the courtroom was packed so tightly, the air itself seemed to hum. Lydia sat at the defendant's table, immaculate in a pale gray suit, her hair swept back like she was posing for a magazine cover. Beside her was Jennifer Rains, composed, confident, flipping through files with practiced calm. Across from them sat my son. Daniel looked smaller than I remembered, though I'd seen him every day. His hands shook slightly as he adjusted his tie. The crutch leaned against the table beside him like an uninvited witness to his weakness. When he glanced back at me, I offered a small nod. He managed a fragile smile, but I could see the tremor beneath it. Judge Morales entered robe-sweeping voice steady. Case of Elwood versus Elwood, Cook County, Circuit Court Division 4. He scanned the room briefly before sitting his gaze flicking over me for half a heartbeat longer than necessary. If he recognized me, he didn't say. Jennifer stood first. Your Honor, she began smoothly, we intend to demonstrate that Mr. Elwood, while once a capable provider, is now physically and emotionally unfit to parent his minor child. His wife, Mrs. Elwood, seeks to ensure stability for their daughter. Lydia lowered her eyes, the perfect picture of quiet suffering. I almost admired the performance. Daniel shifted in his chair. When called to the stand, he rose slowly, one hand gripping the crutch. I heard someone in the gallery whisper, "That's him, the injured one." A flush crept up my son's neck. He took the oath, his voice thin but steady, and sat. Jennifer began her questioning gently at first, then with calculated precision. "Mr. Elwood," she said, "would you describe your current employment situation?" "I'm on leave," Daniel replied. "Physical therapy takes most of my time." "So you're not working?" He hesitated. "Not yet." "And your income?" "I have savings. Insurance. My mother helps." Jennifer tilted her head slightly, her tone almost kind. "So would you say your mother is your primary support system?" Daniel's throat worked. "For now, yes." Jennifer smiled faintly. "And your daughter's Lydia's attorney knew exactly where to aim between pride and pity." My fingers tightened around my briefcase handle. Daniel's voice wavered. "I love my daughter. I take care of her when she's with me." Jennifer leaned closer. "But given your current condition, your limited mobility, your financial dependency, Do you truly believe you can provide a stable home? He opened his mouth, but the words came out broken. I can try. Lydia's lawyer turned toward the judge. No further questions. The silence that followed was unbearable. Even the shuffle of papers stopped. Daniel's shoulders sagged, his eyes fixed on his hands. The gallery buzzed softly, sympathy mixed with judgment. I had spent years watching men and women unravel on that stand, their dignity stripped by logic and language. But nothing prepared me for the sight of my son breaking under it. Every instinct screamed to stand, to object, to tear the case apart, piece by piece. Instead, I pressed my palm against the worn leather of my briefcase. The smell of old paper rose faintly when I shifted it on my lap. Inside were my notes, my research, and one envelope Robert Medina had sent me, proof that could turn the entire case on its head. But it wasn't time yet. Judge Morales adjusted his glasses. "Mr. Elwood," he said, "you may step down." Daniel nodded, gripping his crutch, rising slowly. He stumbled once, catching himself on the rail. Lydia looked away, a flicker of embarrassment passing over her perfect face. I watched him make his way back to his seat, and I could feel the courtroom's collective pity tighten around him like a noose. The humiliation was complete. When he sat, I leaned forward, resting my hand lightly on his shoulder. His skin was cold. I whispered the only words that could fit through the knot in my throat. "Not yet, sweetheart." He didn't answer, but I saw his jaw set the faint spark of defiance returning. And behind him in the second row, I straightened my back, my fingers tracing the briefcase's edge. The courtroom might see a broken man today, but soon they would see who had raised him. For a long moment after Daniel returned to his seat, no one spoke. The murmurs that had filled the courtroom slowly died, replaced by the low hum of fluorescent lights and the quiet rustle of papers. Lydia leaned toward Jennifer, whispering something I couldn't hear, though her smirk returned small, satisfied, venomous. Judge Morales cleared his throat and began to shuffle the next file, signaling for the proceedings to continue. And that was when I stood. The sound of the chair scraping against the floor broke through the stillness like a gunshot. Dozens of heads turned. I could feel every eye in the room on me, but my pulse stayed calm. "Your Honor," I said, my voice steady, "I will represent my son." The words landed in the air with the weight of something both forbidden and inevitable. For a fraction of a second, the judge froze, his gavel suspended halfway to the block. Jennifer Raines looked up sharply, recognition dawning in her eyes. "Mrs. Elwood," Judge Morales began, his tone cautious. "This is an active court proceeding. Are you suggesting—" "Yes," I said. "I'm entering my appearance on behalf of Mr. Daniel Elwood." Gasps rippled through the gallery. The clerk dropped her pen. Lydia's smirk vanished, her color draining, as if the air had been sucked from her lungs. Even Daniel turned to me, his expression a mixture of shock and disbelief. "Mom, what are you doing?" he whispered. "What I should have done sooner," I murmured, then faced the bench again. Judge Morales set down his papers and looked at me for a long moment. "Please approach Mrs. Elwood." I walked forward, each step deliberate. My heels clicked softly against the tile, echoing through the chamber in a rhythm that felt like coming home. When I reached the front, the judge leaned forward, his voice low but heavy with familiarity. "Marjorie Elwood," he said slowly. "Is this the same Marjorie Elwood who once argued State of Illinois v. Broadwell Construction, who dismantled half this county's legal establishment in open court?" A murmur spread across the room like a wave. I met his eyes. "Yes, Your Honor," I said simply. He exhaled, almost a laugh. I thought so. I'd recognize that voice anywhere. Jennifer's expression darkened, her poise faltering for the first time. Lydia looked from her to me, her confusion giving way to something more primal fear. Your Honor, Jennifer protested quickly. This is highly irregular. Mrs. Elwood is not a practicing attorney. She has no current license on record. I retired, I interrupted my tone. Calm, controlled. I never resigned. My credentials remain valid under Illinois State Bar guidelines for reactivation. I've already filed the notice this morning. The courtroom erupted in whispers again. I could hear the distinct sound of a camera shutter somewhere in the back row. Judge Morales nodded slowly, tapping his gavel once for quiet. Then the court acknowledges Mrs. Marjorie Elwood as acting representative for the plaintiff. The words hung there, official, irreversible. I turned to face the gallery. The shift was instant and electric. Reporters scribbled in notebooks, the audience leaned forward, even the bailiff straightened. Lydia sat frozen, her hand gripping the table's edge. Objection, Jennifer said, her composure cracking. This is a conflict of interest. She's emotionally compromised. I looked at her, letting silence stretch until it became unbearable. That's the difference between us, Jennifer, I said softly. You call it compromise. I call it conviction. Her mouth tightened, but she said nothing more. I returned to Daniel's side, placed my hand gently on his shoulder, and opened my old leather briefcase. The hinges creaked, releasing the faint scent of paper and time. Inside, neatly arranged, were my notes, the financial transfers Robert had found, and the photographs Lydia would never want the world to see. Daniel stared at me, eyes wide. Mom, sit tall, I whispered. You don't bow in your own house. Across the room, Judge Morales leaned back, studying me with something between caution and respect. Well, he said finally, his tone almost reverent, it seems the lioness has returned. I met his gaze, unflinching. No, Your Honor, I said quietly. She never left. And with that, the courtroom, for the first time that day, fell completely silent. The next morning, the courthouse was even more crowded. News had spread overnight. Marjorie Elwood was back. Reporters gathered by the entrance microphones poised like weapons, their questions colliding in the cold Chicago air. I ignored them all and walked straight through the front doors, my briefcase steady in hand. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with a nervous kind of anticipation. Lydia sat stiffly at the defense table, her pale hands clenched in her lap. Jennifer tried to look composed, but the faint tremor in her fingers betrayed her. Daniel leaned forward slightly beside me, his face pale but determined. When the judge entered, silence fell. He adjusted his glasses and nodded toward me. Mrs. Elwood, you may proceed. I stood smoothing the page of my notes before speaking. Your Honor, the defense has argued that this property constitutes marital assets to be divided equally. The plaintiff's position, supported by evidence, is that the home located at 2147 West Archer Avenue is non-marital property purchased solely by my client, Mr. Daniel Elwood, prior to his marriage. Jennifer shifted in her seat. Lydia's mother reached for her husband's arm, whispering something sharp. I reached into the briefcase and withdrew a folder bound with a red ribbon. The paper was old, but pristine, the ink faintly smudged from years in storage. I handed it to the bailiff, who carried it to the bench. These are the original purchase and title documents, I continued, dated 3 years before the wedding. The deed lists only one owner, Mr. Elwood. Furthermore, all payments were made from an independent account in his name. The mortgage was satisfied in full before the marriage. The judge examined the documents carefully, nodding once. Clerk, enter these into record as Plaintiff's Exhibit 1. I turned to Jennifer. Counselor, would you care to explain how your client's claim of equal ownership stands under Section 503(2) of the Illinois Marriage and Dissolution of Marriage Act. Her mouth opened, then closed again. Your Honor, she began, while the property was indeed acquired before marriage. Mrs. Elwood contributed financially to its maintenance decor, furnishings improvements. Please specify, I said smoothly. Which improvements? With what funds? Jennifer blinked. Well, I pressed gently but relentlessly, the rhythm returning as naturally as breathing. Do you have receipts? Bank statements. Any record connecting your client's income to those expenditures? Jennifer hesitated. No documented proof at this time. Then it remains an assertion, not evidence, I said. The gallery murmured. Lydia's father frowned, his fingers tightening around the edge of his seat. Her mother leaned close to him, whispering again, panic in her eyes this time. Judge Morales looked down at the papers once more. Mrs. Elwood's counsel, unless you can provide supporting documentation, the court will recognize the Archer Avenue property as non-marital. Jennifer's shoulders sagged. Understood, Your Honor. I nodded, returning to my seat. Daniel exhaled shakily beside me, whispering, You make it sound so easy. I didn't answer. My eyes stayed fixed on Lydia. She was staring straight ahead, but the muscles along her jaw twitched. She wasn't used to losing, especially not like this. Calmly, publicly, without shouting or scandal. The tide had shifted. For the first time, logic was louder than accusation. As the judge called for recess, I gathered my papers, sliding them neatly back into the briefcase. Beneath the quiet order of procedure, I could feel the faint, unmistakable pulse of momentum, steady, deliberate, unyielding. One piece of truth had been laid bare. Many more waited their turn. When the court reconvened, the air felt different, tenser, heavier. Reporters had multiplied in the back rows. Even the bailiff looked uneasy, as if sensing something about to break. I stood with calm deliberation, my fingers brushing against the small USB drive inside my briefcase. Your Honor, I began the plaintiff requests to present Exhibit 2, an audio recording relevant to the custody claim. Jennifer immediately objected. Your Honor, this is improper discovery. But Judge Morales raised a hand. Overruled. Proceed. The clerk inserted the drive into the courtroom computer. A faint hiss filled the speakers, followed by the sound of a door closing and the quiet tremor of a child's voice. Mommy, I don't want to lie. I love Daddy. Lydia's head snapped up. Her complexion drained to white. The courtroom went utterly still. Then her own voice came through the speakers, sharp, commanding, unmistakable. You listen to me, Clara. If you don't tell the judge you want to stay with me, we'll lose everything. You'll lose your room, your toys, your friends. Do you understand? A pause. Then the sound of soft crying. But Daddy's nice to me. He needs me. I don't care what he needs. Lydia's voice cracked like a whip. Say the words or you'll regret it. The child's sobs filled the room. Real, fragile, impossible to misinterpret. Gasps rippled through the gallery, then murmurs, then outrage. One woman covered her mouth. Another shook her head, whispering, Dear God. Even the reporters stopped writing. Lydia leapt to her feet. That's fake. She's lying. Someone spliced it. Order, Judge Morales thundered, striking the gavel. Order in this courtroom. The sound echoed until the murmurs died. Lydia sank back into her chair, trembling, her lips pressed into a colorless line. I remained standing. Your Honor, this recording was obtained lawfully from the child's bedroom monitor. It has been verified for authenticity by a licensed technician. The voices are unaltered. The judge's gaze moved slowly from me to Lydia, then to Daniel, who sat motionless, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. He took a breath. The court requests to hear directly from the minor Clara Elwood. A collective shiver moved through the room. The door to the side chamber opened, and a small figure stepped in her school dress, neat, her eyes red but clear. She clutched a stuffed rabbit in one hand. And for the first time that morning, the room that had been full of arguments and laws fell completely, reverently silent. Clara stood before the bench, small and solemn, her stuffed rabbit clutched so tightly that its fur bunched under her fingers. The bailiff guided her gently to the witness chair, his voice kind, patient. Judge Morales leaned forward, softening his tone in a way I had never heard before. "Clara," he said, "you know you're not in trouble, right?" She nodded, eyes wide. "Yes, sir." "Good. All I want is for you to tell the truth. Do you understand what that means?" "Yes," she whispered. "It means saying what really happened." The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Even the sound of pen on paper stopped. Daniel's hand trembled slightly where it rested on the table. Lydia sat frozen, her face pale, her jaw clenched tight enough to shake. "Can you tell us," the judge continued gently, "where you would like to live, and why?" Clara looked down for a long moment, her lips moving soundlessly as she fought for courage. When she finally spoke, her voice was small, but clear. "I want to live with Daddy," she said, "and Grandma. They take care of me. They don't make me lie." The words fell like stones into the silence. Lydia gasped, a hand flying to her mouth. Her lawyer, Jennifer, closed her eyes briefly, as if the air itself had turned heavy. Clara went on, her voice trembling but resolute. "Mom said I had to tell you I didn't want Daddy, but that's not true. I love him. He helps me with my homework. He makes pancakes on Sundays. Grandma reads with me at night. I don't want to lie anymore." Her small shoulders shook, but she didn't cry. She lifted her chin, looking straight at the judge. "I just want us to be safe." There was a long pause, so long I could hear my own pulse in my ears. Then Judge Morales nodded slowly, his face soft, with something like reverence. "Thank you, Clara," he said. "That was very brave." Jennifer reached for Lydia's arm, but Lydia pulled away, her composure breaking. A choked sob escaped her lips, raw and unguarded. She buried her face in her hands, whispering something only she could hear. Daniel bowed his head, tears streaking down his face. And as I watched my granddaughter's small hand clutch the rabbit again, I realized that all my arguments, all my years of study could never match the power of a single honest child speaking the truth. The courtroom had not yet recovered from Clara's words when Lydia rose from her seat. Her face was pale, her lipstick smudged, her hands trembling, but her voice when it came was sharp and desperate. "She's lying," Lydia said, pointing at me. "You're all being fooled by a washed-up fraud. This woman, this so-called lawyer, was disgraced. She destroyed her own career. Ask anyone in this city who she really is." The words struck like a sudden gust of cold air. For a second, no one spoke. I could feel dozens of eyes shift toward me, some curious, some startled, others wary. Jennifer tugged lightly on Lydia's sleeve, whispering, "Stop, Lydia. Don't do this." But Lydia was far past reason. She left the courtroom in shame. She continued, her voice cracking. "You think she's some hero? No, she was caught in a scandal. She took bribes, or maybe she just couldn't win. Everyone remembers the name Marjorie Elwood." Her words echoed, trembling against the wood-paneled walls. I stood slowly, steadying my breath. There was no anger in me, only the familiar ache of a wound reopened. "Your Honor," I said, my tone calm but resonant. If the defense wishes to discuss my past, I have no objection. Let the truth be heard in full. Judge Morales looked at me, his brow furrowed. Mrs. Elwood, are you sure I am? I turned to the gallery, to the people who had come to watch this family torn apart. 20 years ago, I led a civil case against a group of developers accused of bribing city inspectors to hide dangerous construction violations. We had evidence enough to save hundreds of families from losing their homes. But in the final week, the presiding judge dismissed every piece of it. Later, I discovered why the same developers had bought his silence. I paused, my hands clasped lightly before me. When I tried to expose it, I was told to stay quiet. The system wanted the story buried, and I was made the scapegoat. I refused to lie under oath. So I walked away. A murmur spread through the room. Even the reporters had stopped writing. I didn't leave because I was guilty, I said softly. I left because I couldn't serve a system that had forgotten what justice meant. I lost my name, my reputation, but not my conscience. The silence that followed was different this time, heavy, but not hostile. I looked to the bench. Judge Morales leaned forward, his expression grave, yet filled with something like compassion. For the record, he said, his voice carrying through every corner of the courtroom, everything Mrs. Elwood has stated is true. He turned to the audience. At the time, I was a junior attorney under her supervision. I watched her fight that case with integrity few of us could have matched. When the corruption was uncovered years later, her name should have been cleared. It is my honor, he said, his tone rising with quiet conviction, to acknowledge publicly and on record that Mrs. Marjorie Elwood did not fall from grace. She chose grace over corruption. The courtroom erupted in murmurs, but none dared interrupt. Lydia's face drained of all color. Jennifer lowered her head, pressing her lips together, the first glint of respect in her eyes. Daniel reached for my hand, gripping it tightly. "Mom," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I never knew." I squeezed his hand, my throat too tight to answer. The judge's gavel struck once clear and final. "Let the record show," he said, "that truth, though buried, does not die." And as the sound echoed through the chamber, I felt something inside me, something I hadn't dared to name in decades, finally exhale. The final day of the hearing dawned gray and windless, the kind of Chicago morning that felt suspended between seasons. I arrived early, as I always did, my steps echoing softly down the marble corridor. Daniel walked beside me, the strain of the last weeks visible in the lines around his eyes, but there was something new there too, resolve. When we entered the courtroom, even the chatter sounded different. The usual sharp energy had dulled into a quiet hum, the audience subdued, expectant. Lydia sat rigidly at the defense table, her lawyer beside her, both looking as though they were waiting for a storm they couldn't avoid. Judge Morales entered precisely at 9. He adjusted his glasses, glanced at the docket, and said, "The court has reached a decision." A hush fell so complete that even the air seemed to pause. After reviewing all presented evidence, he began including financial documentation, property deeds, recorded testimony, and the statement of the minor child. This court finds that the residence located at 2147 West Archer Avenue was purchased and owned solely by the plaintiff, Mr. Daniel Elwood, prior to marriage. Therefore, full ownership is awarded to him. Lydia gasped, her hands gripping the table's edge. Jennifer leaned in, whispering urgently, but the damage was done. The judge continued. Regarding custody of the minor child, Clara Elwood, he said, his tone softening, the court has considered her age, her expressed wishes, and the evidence presented regarding parental conduct. Custody will be granted jointly to the plaintiff, Mr. Elwood, and the child's grandmother, Mrs. Marjorie Elwood. Mrs. Elwood's demonstrated stability and moral standing qualify her to provide primary support and oversight of the child's welfare. My breath caught. For a moment, the words didn't register. Daniel turned to me stunned. The judge went on. The defendant, Mrs. Lydia Elwood, is granted limited supervised visitation to be reviewed after a 6-month period of demonstrated stability and compliance with court-ordered counseling. The gavel came down one solid echoing strike. For a moment, no one moved. Then somewhere in the back, a woman began to clap softly. Another followed. Soon the sound spread gentle, respectful, not triumphant, but deeply human. Lydia lowered her head, silent tears streaking her cheeks. Jennifer placed a hand on her arm, but she didn't respond. Daniel exhaled a long, shuddering breath, his shoulders trembling. When he turned to me, his expression was something I hadn't seen in years. Relief without bitterness. He reached for my hand, then stood his crutch unsteady, but his gaze clear. "Mom," he whispered, his voice breaking. "We did it." I tried to speak, but no words came. My throat tightened, and I felt the first tears slide down my cheeks, quiet, unrestrained cleansing. He pulled me into his arms, holding on like the boy he once was, the boy who used to run to me after scraped knees and broken toys. Only now the wound had been something larger, his dignity, his future, and somehow we had pieced it back together. Judge Morales removed his glasses, watching us with a faint smile. "Mr. Elwood," he said, "Mrs. Elwood, your family has endured more than most. May you both remember that truth and compassion, when held together, are stronger than any law I can write." I nodded through the tears, unable to answer. As we stepped out of the courtroom into the pale afternoon light, the cold wind off the lake swept through the open doors. It carried away the tension, the bitterness, the long ache of years spent in silence. For the first time in decades, justice had not only been served, it had been restored, and in its quiet return, it had brought with it something far rarer: peace. Spring arrived quietly that year, without fanfare or the rush of sudden warmth. The snow melted in patient streaks along the fence, revealing small shoots of green that had waited months for their chance. I spent most mornings in the back garden, my knees in the dirt, coaxing life from the stubborn soil behind the house on West Archer Avenue. The same house that once felt like a battleground now breathed again, slowly, peacefully. Clara's laughter drifted through the open kitchen window, soft and bright like wind chimes. She was under the maple tree, tracing circles in the grass with a stick, her stuffed rabbit still tucked under one arm. I smiled. The doctor said children forget pain easily, but I wasn't sure that was true. Clara didn't forget. She grew past it, and that was something braver. Daniel came outside carrying 2 mugs of tea. He still moved carefully, favoring his right leg, but the cane no longer looked like defeat. It looked like rhythm. He lowered himself into the wooden chair beside mine, wincing only slightly as he sat. "You've been out here since sunrise," he said. "The neighbors will think you're farming." "Let them think what they like," I replied, wiping the dirt from my hands. "Things worth keeping need tending." He smiled, glancing toward Clara. "She sleeps through the night now," he said. "No nightmares." "Children follow the tone of a home," I murmured. "When it's calm, they feel safe enough to dream again." He was quiet for a moment. Then, with that careful, familiar hesitance, he said, "Mom, I've been offered a consulting position part-time at first. It's engineering work again. They're willing to make adjustments for everything." I looked at him the way sunlight caught the faint streaks of gray at his temples, and felt the deep, quiet satisfaction that comes when a long journey bends toward healing. "Then take it," I said. "You've earned your second start." He nodded, eyes glistening. I couldn't have done this without you. I reached over and covered his hand. You did this, Daniel. I just reminded you who you were. From inside, the old clock chimed 6. Dusk crept slowly across the garden, painting the house in soft amber light. The sky above Chicago carried the faint hum of the city traffic far away, a train whistle, the kind of noise that becomes its own form of comfort. Clara ran to the porch, cheeks flushed, hair tangled from play. "Grandma, can we turn on the light?" she asked. "Daddy says you always do it first." I smiled, standing carefully and brushing the dirt from my skirt. The porch light had been a habit of mine since Daniel was small, a way of keeping the night from swallowing us whole. For years it had meant waiting, hoping, sometimes praying. But now it felt different. It wasn't a beacon for someone lost, it was a promise to ourselves. I flipped the switch. The soft golden glow spilled across the steps, reaching the edges of the garden where the tulips had just begun to bloom. Clara twirled in the light, laughing, as if the world itself were new. Behind me, Daniel leaned against the doorway, tea in hand. "It looks good, doesn't it?" he said quietly. "It does," I answered. "It always has." We stood there together, watching the light spread, gentle, unhurried, constant. The air smelled of earth and new beginnings. The storm that had nearly broken us was over. The house stood strong. And for the first time in years, the silence that followed wasn't empty, it was full. When the last of the daylight faded, I looked at the porch lamp one more time, glowing steady against the dark. It wasn't lit for someone's return anymore. It was lit because we had finally come home.